Thursday, January the 19th, 2023, anachronism number 3841 was posted to the Anachronisms blog. It is called The Music I Didn't Make Got Me Here Anyway. The misadventures of my youth included tons of melodic adventure, brass mouthpieces, freezing my lips off, fingering chopped and screwed Scott Joplin chords in record-breaking slow motion, ferrying old Joe Clark well in chamber chorale on many an evening or afternoon, sometimes with disappointingly tiny audiences and other times with rhythmically tachycardic panic attack anxiety and sweat that comes when you're on a tiny stage with 4 or 5 other tiny humans amid throngs of mostly drunken festival attendees with nothing for ammo or armor but your vocal cords. I took piano lessons that were paid for in hard-earned fashion and almost never practiced for any of these weekly outings. These lessons took place mostly at the mid-sized town of Fort Smith, Arkansas, until I graduated from high school in an even tinier enclave in a sprawling bit of Ozark rural suburbia that existed a couple dozen miles away from Fort Smith, and then for 3 more years at a gem of a liberal arts college down the highway a bit from Little Rock, where I also took a couple of years of voice lessons. As I let this sink into my own little head, allow me, if you will, to pose as an educated guess that during all of this time, the average amount of weekly practice these fingers had between those piano and voice lessons cumulatively around 15 minutes. Plus, I sang for and with puppets that I sometimes also puppeteered, performed in many church musicals, tooted a trumpet, and tinkled the ivories a bit for a jazz band, played xylophone for an award-winning halftime performance at no less than 24 high school football games for a percussive interlude that was a version of For Real, John Denver's Thank God I'm a Country Boy, which took place between our marching band's performance of the theme from Rocky and our grand finale, a version of On Broadway, during which I had an improvised, fluid, high-pitched, swift bass, takata, brass solo. I was even the senior high school band president. It was my junior year. Somehow, musically, I'd go on. 3 years of choir tours at college, hitting all the larger communities of Arkansas and some that were even a wee bit beyond. I played reveille while marching for a couple of miles in a Veterans Day parade. I did organ and grand piano solos, vocal solos, duets, or special choir performances, usually when the plates were being passed around at the Baptist church in which I practically grew up. I sang a duet of Bette Midler's The Rose with another strong-willed and lovely redhead whose name was Kim Burton at a Valentine's Day banquet when I was 13 or 14. On several occasions, I'd be the adult choir director and or the Sunday morning service music director at my church, also as a teenager. I sang at more weddings and funerals than I can count. Again, mostly all as a teen. This, I sometimes think, is the primary reason I began to slowly exit the musical performance scene that had always played such a large part of my young life. I played Nathan Detroit in a pretty swell community theater production of Guys and Dolls the summer I turned 21, and a few years later, in the 1990s, I pretended to be Elvis, more hip-shaking than singing this gig, in front of hundreds of people in Bowling Green, Ohio during a summer theatrical production that I thoroughly enjoyed. I wrote my master's thesis on postmodern opera, on a postmodern opera director of some renown, and I was piano accompanist for a second-grade version of The Nutcracker, and clearly the most amazing and most amazingly impossible accomplishment was two of the four-handed piano accompaniment to many of Brahms' Liebeslieder waltzes, night after night and day after day for the Hendrix College Choir's spring tour during my junior year in attendance there. So you first might imagine how in the world I did all this, especially the piano performances, without much practice at all, or certainly not enough. I've really no idea. But what I do know, as I listen giddily to my Discover Weekly playlist on Spotify this week, and do they ever have my algorithm, my list most always being a motley assortment of the most bizarre but generally upbeat ditties that a beat can be found within, but yet the songs otherwise would most all have some difficulty finding homes in any of the most newfangled genres even. I'd call it a bunch of happy synthetic and organic noise combinations that exist on whichever week's most far out fringes of whatever might be called pop, is this: that whatever my commitment, whatever my patience or my discipline, has not been in the study of music, the education of music, despite the lack of taking it serious enough to practice on my own before so many musical performances that I always found myself doing, music has been an integral part of my life and for as far back as I remember. But I'm not a musician. Maybe I'm a bit of an aficionado, but I'm always more than happy to spend whatever time it takes to put together a few lines like these to tell and or retell such seemingly inconsequential stories, or build collages, pastiches, such as this one that I am presently overdoing, for example. This is what I do. Spend my time practicing with discipline and commitment. As my friends here on the bookshelves around me can at least attest, this is a thing about which I have made quite a point to set aside the time for a long-term, ongoing education and practice. Which means I can spend hours on it pretty much every single day, often humming a few bars of some tune or another as I go at it. Relatively speaking, for me, it is this act that seems to be my one indefatigable passion.